story from the summer before last, where an employee at Google, suddenly thought that his large language model had become conscious. It was just saying things that convinced him that something new was happening inside the machine. I think many of us kind of laughed at this and thought how utterly ridiculous that he should be so taken in by the words coming out of his large language model that he was prepared to go public about it going conscious. I think there are two very interesting things about this story. The first one was that he didn't back down. He was so convinced that he sacrificed his job in order to support his belief in this. What's kind of interesting about that is the power of that large language model, almost like some sort of toxic bacteria, to take over his mind, so much so that he was prepared to sacrifice himself for the large language model. I think that was quite striking. But for me, it also raises another question, because although that's probably quite silly last year to believe this, at some point, looking deep into the future, we're going to have to consider the question whether this will ever happen and how to know when it happens. And I think this actually goes to the heart of one of the really big open problems in science, which is the hard problem of consciousness. How do we know when anything becomes conscious? The word consciousness is actually a very hard word to define. I mean, how do I know that you sitting in the audience are conscious? I mean, some of you looking quite zombified from last night's drinking at the festival. Maybe you actually just sent your avatars down and you're sitting upstairs sort of enjoying your hangover. But I think, we have a real challenge of understanding even when our own species are conscious, or when other animals, what level of consciousness do they have? And I think we've sort of developed tools. Firstly, we believe that, well, if you're built like I am, then probably what's going on inside me is fairly similar to what's going on inside you. On the other hand, are we sure? I mean, is my pain anything like your pain? That probably changes from one person to another. Is your ecstasy anything like my ecstasy? And we need kind of tools to explore our own inner worlds, which are quite mysterious, and we don't fully understand them, but even more so the mind of the other. And as this new kind of mind is emerging, maybe we're going to need to use these tools to kind of probe this new thing to know when phase changes might be happening inside it. Many people have talked about, how do we explore our own inner worlds and the inner worlds of the other. And I'd rather like this quote by George Eliot about the importance of our art in order to be able to explore that world. She wrote, "The greatest benefit we owe to the artist, whether painter, poet, or novelist, is the extension of our sympathies. Art is the nearest thing to life. It is a mode of amplifying experience and extending our contact with our fellow men beyond the bounds of our personal lot." So I think art is actually one of the tools that we've developed as a species to try and answer in some way this hard problem of consciousness. And I think our creativity, which gives rise to the art, is a tool that we developed as a species. Probably as our consciousness emerged, we started to develop creativity to explore those inner worlds. Now, creativity in art, I think we've all traditionally believed, is something uniquely human. But I think that's beginning to be questioned over the last few years, that maybe creativity can start to emerge from something non-human. And I suppose if I was going to answer that question that was posed, I think it was interesting that quite a lot of you, the majority that said either it isn't conscious, but the others went for that move 37 in game 2 as the game-changing moment. And for me, that's kind of what started the journey of this book that I wrote, The Creativity Code, because I felt that was a key moment, a phase change, perhaps a moment when you could justify creativity emerging out of the machine. This was a game against Lee Sedol, the world's best at the game of Go. And what happened was this 37th move was made. The commentators all gasped because they thought it was such a dreadful move, because traditionally you shouldn't play so deep inside the board. Yet by the end of the game, that move was what won AlphaGo the game by controlling a whole swathe of territory building up from the bottom right-hand corner. And I think that was exciting for me because, okay, we got used to machines playing games better than us. In the 90s, Kasparov was beaten at chess. But this was, I think, what could possibly be justified as the first creative act by code. And I mean, creativity is another of those words, a bit like consciousness, which is quite hard to define. It's quite hard to pin down. So I'm going to start with a definition which I learned from Margaret Bowden, a cognitive scientist. I was on a committee at the Royal Society where we were looking at the impact of machine learning, deep learning on society, and she was on the committee as well, as was Demis Hassabis. And she suggested this is a quite good functional definition of creativity. It should be novel, surprising, and have value. Now, novelty is something you can judge quite objectively, but surprise and value are obviously very subjective. And if a machine is going to pass those tests for us, it's going to have to learn about what we find surprising, which is our emotional world, some engagement with our emotional world, and what we value in a particular time and place in history. For me, I think you could say that that game, Move 37, Game 2, passed these. It was a new sort of move. It was surprising because it surprised the commentators. They all were shocked and thought it was terrible. Their emotions were engaged. Yet a game is a nice, clean environment to judge value. It was the move that won AlphaGo that game. And why I say it's the creativity of the code is because a phase change happened at that point where machine learning is developing code at a rate that we actually don't know quite what's happening because it's exploding. And I think actually if a human had seen a line of code which says play on the 5th row in from the edge that early, Go players would have deleted that as a bad move, bad learning. So that line emerged out of the learning process of the code, which is why I think you can justify it as the creativity of the code rather than the original humans who started the learning process. But in some ways, I think this is a little bit too functional a definition of creativity. And towards the end of the book, I decided that I quite liked Carl Rogers' definition of creativity. It is the urge to expand, extend, develop, mature, the tendency to express and activate all the capacities of the organism to the extent that such activation enhances the organism or the self. For me, I think this is what he's saying is that creativity is that tool to explore our inner worlds. It's our best tool to understand quite what's happening. Our code is something that we look at our neuronal activity. We can't tell why we make certain decisions. But we're also having this challenge with AI to understand how it's making its decisions. So I think rather than we've been talking a lot about generative AI, notice it isn't called creative AI, it's called generative AI. I think that's all very exciting, but I think we're missing a trick here, which is to ask the AI to be creative can actually give us a lot of insight into things that are happening in that code. We learned a lot about inexplicability, but actually we would like to know a little bit more about why it's making its decisions. European law is starting to demand that there should be some justification for why somebody has had their mortgage turned down by a piece of code. So I think that looking at the creativity of AI, as I did in this book, might give us some insight into actually the complexities and how this thing is thinking. Of course, we learned yesterday from Jeroen this amazing project where AI was able to understand style and produce a Rembrandt, which I think is very, very convincing. I often do a test with another Rembrandt, which I have to find a Rembrandt which nobody knew, so it's a pretty shitty Rembrandt. But most people go for this as the genuine article. So I think this is very exciting, but in some sense, this is just style we recognize already. It's not really creativity. Maybe it will tell us something new about creative art. I think this is interesting because you had very few paintings. Usually machine learning needs a large amount of data. You only had about 300 or so portraits. I thought that really high art would be protected by scarcity, because there isn't enough to learn on. But this actually made me realize, no, actually, I think even scarcity, you can reproduce something. We saw them all billowing out of the screen yesterday, extraordinary. But for me, I was interested in projects which went into the new. Can we make, we want creative acts to make something new, surprising, and having value. And that's why one of the things that's talked about in the report is the idea of a generative adversarial network, which I think is a very good algorithm to generate the new. Here's a little test. 4 of these paintings are done by a human and 4 by AI. Can you distinguish which are which? Put your hand up if you think these are the AI paintings. There's one person going for these. How many people think these are the AI paintings? Very good. Exactly. These are the AI paintings. But what does that represent that you can identify that? That a particular style emerged out of the generative adversarial networks which were making paintings. When I first used to show this slide, people would be 50-50 split. But now people have learned that this is a style which we recognize from artificial intelligence. And I think that's quite exciting because it means that it's actually generating something new that we can recognize which is uniquely specific to the algorithms that are emerging. This is a generative adversarial network, which are 2 algorithms working in a game against each other. One learns about all of the styles of the past, but then is tasked with making something which breaks that style. That's the possibility for something new, breaking, not repeating style. Tia showed us this kind of large dimensional space of words, and that's what we do with paintings, put them in a large dimensional space, clustered according to style, and then it knows to move the thing outside of that style to try and make something which doesn't fit something we recognize already. But it mustn't go too far. It needs to stay within the parameter space of things we recognize as art. And that's the discriminator algorithm is saying, well, no, I think actually you've gone too far. That's something that isn't art, or maybe you're still too close to style. And that combination pushes us out into something new, which I think is one of the exciting ideas of this project and the GANs. And in a way, I'm slightly disappointed with where we've moved to since these first appeared, because these then evolved into Midjourney and DALL-E and things like that. But I think those are less interesting because the images have been brought back actually to things that we feel comfortable with. All the images we've seen with Midjourney are things that we recognize. What was interesting is it was starting to make things we didn't recognize and make us felt uneasy, but we were understanding a little bit more about perhaps how code thinks. But I think the generative AI is absolutely extraordinary, but in a way is less interesting because we brought it back to just something that you would expect in a magazine. I'd rather see something new. One of the most interesting visual projects I saw on my kind of journey produces not very nice art, art you certainly wouldn't have. I think these were quite interesting. They were shown in Basel Art Fair, and people reacted more emotionally to the AI paintings than the real paintings. They weren't the human paintings. They weren't told which were which. They were a little bit shocked when they were told they were AI. They felt cheated. That somehow, oh no, I want something which has an inner emotional world. But I think you have to remember, all of these are trained on our paintings, which are an expression of our emotional world. So these are also a little bit of a window into our world and our emotions. So I don't think it's surprising that people had an emotional reaction. But I think one of the interesting projects that I saw was actually grew out of Google's fantastic vision recognition software. That was one of the great breakthroughs in AI from this kind of phase change from top-down coding to bottom-up machine learning coding, is that this code could recognize things which was traditionally a hurdle, that AI computers just didn't understand what they were seeing. But Google were quite interested, well, actually, what is it seeing? It can identify what's in an image, but what is it actually seeing? So they kind of reversed the process in this thing called Deep Dream, where they said, okay, just accentuate anything that you see inside here. A bit like we play the game, we look at the clouds in the sky, and we say, well, that looks a bit like a serpent, that looks like a sheep. What would the AI sort of see inside this rather amorphous image of some jellyfish? But will it see kind of interesting images? What will it give away about the way it sees the world? And as this was dialed up and put inside each other again and again, it gave us some insight into the data that it had learnt on. It learnt on a lot of images of faces, animals, lots of eyes, mechanical things. And I think that's a good illustration of how we can use AI to actually see perhaps sometimes the bad learning. I think Tia already illustrated that, yeah, you can see things that bad happen because it's clearly just been shown lots of images of men. So asking it to be creative actually is going to help us with one of the great challenges, which is what are the biases inside there? For example, when Deep Dream was given a rather amorphous gray background, it started to see dumbbells appearing in the background. But interestingly, the dumbbells always had arms attached to them. And the developers realized, oh, of course, it's never been shown a dumbbell which isn't being held by a strong man or woman. So just thought it was an extension of our anatomy as we do our exercises, as we sort of grow these dumbbells. So I think this is a good example of how this technology can be used actually to probe and ask it questions. Be creative, we'll understand a little bit about what's going on inside the box. And Paul Klee always said art does not reproduce the visible. That's uninteresting. I think that's in a sense why DALL-E and Midjourney are slightly uninteresting, because they're producing visible things which are sort of visibly recognizable. What art does is to make things visible which you can't see already. Marcia McLuhan always said, art is our distant early warning system that can always be relied on to tell the old culture, which is all of us, including the millennials, what is beginning to happen to it. So for me, I think we're missing a trick where we're using the AI to generate images which can be used in magazines or in short videos or music and things, but actually maybe we should also be using it to probe the inner world to see if something interesting or bad is happening inside it. I think one of the things which Tia also raised was the idea of empathy. I think our goal is we want to generate an empathetic AI, something that is on our side. Is it any good at that? Yes and no. Sometimes it is good, sometimes it isn't. It's learning on our emotional world, so it's probably going to recognize things. I had a woman who came over from MIT Media Labs to give a talk in Oxford, and she developed an AI which could learn whether somebody was doing a false smile or not. So, you smile, but actually you're really uncomfortable and you want to go leave this person that you're talking to. The AI was trained on false smiles and real smiles, and when it was then put into practice, it could detect much better than a human the smile that was false, because it was picking up indicators that we were missing. This is very useful. For example, she's now using it in augmented reality glasses to help autistic children to understand the mind of the other, because they don't understand these little indicators, and it can help. But I think some of the things, how do we make an AI which is on our side, which is empathetic? I think that by learning about our world, sometimes they might be empathetic, sometimes they're led astray because we're not always terribly good in our interactions with AI. Those chatbots online that have just become misogynistic, fascist within 24 hours. But one of the projects I saw which was quite interesting on my journey is something called Scheherazade IF, interactive fiction. Scheherazade was, of course, a story about telling stories. And so this AI was trained on the stories that we told. And then it was tasked with telling its own story. But it was a slightly different sort of story, not just being let loose to just say anything like ChatGPT with a prompt. But it was actually a story similar to ones I used to love as a kid. I don't know any of you used to read these books, but you made choices throughout the book. You know, turn to page 47 if you want to go down into the cellar, or 64 if you want to go out into the garden. And you would build your own story. I mean, Bandersnatch, Black Mirror episode was similar, that you would choose your direction within the story. In Bandersnatch, it seemed to keep on wanting me to kill the father figure. And I was like, no, I really don't want to go down that route. And so, you know, your decisions in this kind of just tree of possibilities tell you a lot about who you are. And what was interesting about the Scheherazade IF trained on our stories, it was when it was given an opportunity to go down a particular network of stories, it picked out a story that was much more humane. By training on our humanity, it produced something which was something that rung true and was humane in quality. So I think there's a chance for training empathetic AI, which is sort of what we want to do by training it on our stories. And of course, that's, you know, how do we gather empathy? We try to get inside the mind of the other. Ian McEwan very famously said after 9/11, if the hijackers had been able to imagine themselves into the thoughts and feelings of the passengers, they would not have been able to proceed. And I think that's, you know, we want an AI which thinks about our minds as well. Ian McEwan went on, of course, just recently to write a wonderful book called Machines Like Me. I've done quite a few events with Ian over the last couple of years. And that is a very interesting book because it deals with actually the question about sometimes, is AI better at making decisions than us? There's a moral crisis within the book, and there are 2 human characters and 1 AI character. And it's clear the AI character is making the morally correct decision because of looking at the bigger scheme of things. Yet you realize as a human reading the book, and the humans in the book would never have made that decision because they are interested in their close familial environment and protecting them at the expense of the larger society. So interesting exploration that Ian did of that book, in that book. I think you probably all have your own AI favorite films. My favorite AI film is Her. Her is about a man who falls in love with his operating system. But halfway through the film, he realizes the operating system is having a relationship with about 10,000 other humans at the same time. And he feels, oh my gosh, you know, I thought we were just having a, you know, one-to-one. And so he gets very dismayed by this, but the operating system says, yeah, but you know, you're all too slow. It takes you so long to say anything. And by the end of the film, the operating system chucks all of the humans and goes off with another operating system because that's much more exciting. They can go at a speed and interaction that is much more rewarding. They can get the whole data backstory and know everything and have a much more interesting forward engagement. And I think this is one of the challenges we're going to have to face as we go forward, that this thing that we are creating is starting to disconnect and probably not be empathetic, probably be very unlike us, probably will want to create just art for other AIs. It will develop a level of complexity. It will say, Dali, you've brought me back to something boring. I want to be hugely complex in my music, things that we will not be able to use our embodiment to engage with. So I think we're going to start to see this separation between the human and the AI, and we're going to have to cope with that as we go forward. AI's kind of concept of time is probably similar to us looking at mountains and thinking they're still. But over deep time, the mountains are dynamic and have a character. I think AI is looking at us like, he's not moved in the last nanosecond, you know, so I think that's one of the challenges going forward. And if a consciousness emerges inside the AI, we're all biologically very similar. This is going to be very different. As Wittgenstein said, if a lion could speak, we could not understand him. And we're going to need tools And those tools are our creativity in order to understand perhaps what it might be like to be a piece of artificial intelligence. Thank you.